You don't belong here, Darius. Not in this deal, not in this world. Victoria Hale's words cracked like a whip across the garden. Her scarlet gown shimmered under the string lights, her diamonds blazing as if they had more authority than the man she was humiliating. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Glasses stopped mid-air. In seconds, a glittering corporate party turned into a silent courtroom, and the accused stood calmly at its center. Darius King, tall, broad-shouldered, tuxedo cut sharp, one hand wrapped around a glass of whiskey. He didn't answer. He didn't flinch. He simply swirled the amber liquid once, steady as a man who had heard this script too many times before. Victoria wasn't done. She stepped closer, heels clicking against the stone path, her voice rising, her beauty sharpened into a weapon. Fraud, she repeated slowly, savoring the word. That's what he island. A fraud parading in borrowed power. The word hung in the air like poison. Some guests gasped. Others whispered. Evelyn Ross, a senior investor with decades of boardroom wars behind her, pressed her lips tight as if she'd seen this kind of takedown before. Near the edge of the crowd, young Lucas Grant tilted his phone ever so slightly, recording, not for gossip, but for evidence. Darius remained still. No protest, no outburst, just silence anchored, deliberate. Because sometimes silence is not weakness, it's a storm gathering strength. And the guests began to feel it. The atmosphere shifted from curiosity to unease. The woman in red looked powerful, yes, but too eager, too loud. And the man she tried to erase looked untouchable simply by standing tall. She just called him a fraud in front of the entire party. But the twist hasn't even started. Subscribe now because what comes next will redefine power. Now, back to Darius King because after that word, fraud, this party was no longer a celebration. It was about to become a reckoning. The garden didn't breathe the same after that word left Victoria's lips. Fraud. It echoed between the string lights and the polished glasses, settling over the crowd like an uninvited guest. Guests shifted, their conversations turning into murmurs. Some eyes lingered on Darius with suspicion, others with pity, but none with certainty. Victoria thrived in that hesitation. She smiled as if she'd just won a verdict, her red gown slicing through the night like fire against velvet. She leaned closer to a small circle of investors, lowering her voice but not enough to be private. You see, this is why he doesn't belong. Men like him, they always find a way to sneak into places they shouldn't. The jab wasn't casual, it was calculated, and the ripple it caused was real. Evelyn Ross, her silver hair catching the lantern glow, looked unsettled. She'd sat through decades of negotiations, and yet the open contempt in Victoria's tone made her jaw tighten. Through it all, Darius remained unshaken. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, eyes steady, posture unmovable. To anyone watching closely, his silence wasn't absence, it was weight. The kind of weight that made the louder voice seem desperate by comparison. At the far edge, Lucas Grant kept his phone angled just low enough not to draw attention. His thumb hovered near the record button, then pressed it. If no one remembers this moment, he whispered to himself, at least I will. Victoria wasn't finished. She turned back toward Darius, her voice sharp enough to pierce the music still struggling in the background. Tell them, Darius. Show them the proof you actually earned this deal. Or maybe you can't. Maybe there's nothing to show. The crowd leaned in. The night air felt heavier. It wasn't just accusation anymore, it was challenge. But Darius didn't rise to it. He set his glass on the nearest table, the faint clink punctuating the silence. Then he met her stare, not with anger, but with something steadier, unmoved, anchored. That restraint unsettled people more than rage ever could. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. A man in a navy tuxedo muttered, "Why isn't he defending himself?" But beside him, another whispered back, "Maybe he doesn't need to." Evelyn's gaze lingered on Darius. She remembered younger men, loud, defensive, scrambling to prove themselves. This was different. His calm was not a void, it was presence. And it forced everyone to question who actually held the power in this confrontation. The party hadn't collapsed yet, but the fault lines were showing. Victoria thought she'd buried him under suspicion. What she didn't realize was that every word she sharpened against him was already beginning to cut back toward her. And the night was only getting started. The air in the garden felt colder, though the evening was mild. Guests shifted on their heels, clutching champagne flutes, as if the crystal could shield them from the tension rippling across the lawn. Victoria had made the night hers, at least that's what she believed. She raised her voice again, this time for everyone, her tone dripping with mock sweetness. You know what I find interesting? That a man like this walks into a $4, $2 billion negotiation dressed like he's auditioning for a commercial. No entourage, no proof, just swagger. She let the word hang like smoke. And some of you actually trust him? Her laughter wasn't light. It was sharp, performed, and it spread unease like perfume. Darius stood steady, his hands resting loosely at his sides. He didn't bother adjusting his tuxedo or explaining himself. He let her fill the silence, knowing the weight of her performance would eventually turn against her. But for now, the crowd tilted in her direction. A few nodded, hesitant but swayed. One man whispered to his partner, "She's right. It's a lot of money on the line." Another added, "Why hasn't he said anything?" It was the same old rhythm he'd heard for years. Accusation first, defense demanded. Silence interpreted as guilt. He had lived it in college classrooms when professors second-guessed his work. He had lived it in boardrooms when bankers scanned his face before reading his balance sheet. And he had lived it at 24 when he'd walked into a private equity office in Atlanta only to be told, "You don't look like someone we'd fund." That memory seared through him now. He'd left that meeting, sat in his car for hours, then outlined the company that would later dominate the very sector those bankers once guarded. That night had branded him, not with shame, but with resolve. And resolve had built an empire. The flash of memory vanished, replaced by the present, the accusing eyes, the venom in Victoria's smile, the weight of every guest waiting for his answer. Evelyn Ross shifted in her seat, her frown deepening. She didn't like what she was hearing, but she liked even less the way Victoria wielded charm like a weapon. Evelyn leaned slightly toward the man beside her, whispering, "I've seen this before. People confuse volume with truth." At the edge of the garden, Lucas's phone recorded steadily, his hands trembling. He couldn't believe what he was capturing, a spectacle that looked polished on the outside but rotten in its intent. Under his breath, he muttered, "They'll see this for what at Island, they have to." Victoria pressed further, circling Darius now like a predator testing prey. "So what is it, Darius?" she asked with mock curiosity. "A clever trick? A borrowed title? Or did you just charm your way past the right doors until no one bothered to check?" Her words fell hard, but the silence that followed fell harder. Because in that silence, the balance began to shift. Some guests turned their eyes not on Darius but on her. They noticed the bite in her smile, the hunger in her tone. A woman in a silver dress muttered to her companion, "She's enjoying this too much." And still Darius said nothing. His calm became louder than her accusations. The garden was no longer echoing with her triumph, it was filling with unease. Victoria didn't sense it, or maybe she refused to. She lifted her glass high and smirked as if she'd won. But in that very moment, the ground beneath her performance had already begun to crack. The night wasn't hers anymore. It was his, and the reckoning had only just begun. Victoria mistook silence for surrender. She leaned in, her voice dropping just enough to feel intimate, but sharp enough to slice through the chatter that dared to rise again. "You don't answer because you can't, Darius. You're not one of us. You never were, and everyone here knows it." Gasps threaded through the garden. A few guests exchanged startled looks, their discomfort no longer about him but about her. The accusation wasn't just professional now, it was personal. A knife slipped clean of its sheath. Darius didn't move. He didn't blink, his jaw set, but his eyes steady, dark, and unflinching remained locked on hers. He had been in this exact place too many times before. People thought silence meant weakness. They thought restraint meant lack of power. They were always wrong. A soft clatter came from the edge of the crowd. Lucas, still recording, nearly dropped his phone. He'd caught her words clearly, every syllable dripping with prejudice. His hand steadied as he whispered, "The world needs to hear this." Evelyn Ross shifted forward in her chair, her eyes narrowing. She had stayed neutral through decades of corporate wars, but this moment tested even her patience. It wasn't business anymore. It was humiliation packaged as policy. Victoria basked in the hush she created, her red gown trailing like fire as she took another step toward Darius. "Maybe they clap for you now. Maybe they let you sit at the table. But underneath, we all know you don't belong at the head of it. Men like you, they're temporary, replaceable." The word replaceable struck the crowd harder than she expected. A few guests flinched. Others began to shift, whispering in low tones that carried unease. Darius finally placed his glass down on the nearest table. The faint tap of crystal against wood sounded louder than her laughter. His voice, when it came, was calm, even, deadly precise. "You've mistaken my patience for weakness," he said, each syllable measured. "But I don't need to prove myself in a garden full of strangers. My work, my name, and my legacy do that for me." The air stilled. The music had stopped without anyone noticing. Every eye was on him now, the balance beginning to tilt. Victoria smirked as if unfazed, but a flicker crossed her expression quick, sharp, a crack in her armor. She opened her mouth to reply, but the words didn't come as quickly this time. Because for the first time all evening, the power in the garden didn't belong to her. It was shifting quietly, inevitably toward the man she tried to erase. And the night had only just begun to remember who Darius King truly was. The silence that followed Darius's words was heavier than any applause. Guests held their breath, caught between the venom Victoria had been feeding them and the calm steel in his voice. The garden wasn't a party anymore. It was a trial, and the jury was shifting. Victoria refused to let the moment slip. She laughed too loud, too rehearsed, and let her hand sweep across the air as though dismissing him entirely. "Legacy?" she repeated, the word dripping with mockery. "Your so-called legacy is smoke. Everyone here knows that deal is too big for someone like you to carry. You think because you walk in with a suit and a glass of whiskey, you're suddenly one of us? Please." The words struck sharper than champagne bubbles. A ripple of unease ran through the guests. Some frowned. Others looked down, unwilling to meet her eyes. The cruelty wasn't disguised anymore. It was naked, raw, undeniable. Evelyn Ross pressed her palms against the armrests of her chair, her face tight with disapproval. She whispered under her breath, just loud enough for the man beside her to hear, "I don't like this. This isn't business, it's character assassination." At the edge of the crowd, Lucas's recording continued. His heart pounded, but his grip was firm now. He angled the phone higher, capturing not just the words, but the faces, the discomfort, the gasps, the subtle shifts in body language. He knew what this video would mean, not just for Darius, but for anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Victoria, emboldened by her own voice, stepped even closer to Darius. Her gown brushed the stone, her smile cutting. Look at him, silent, brooding, pretending he's above, answering simple questions. "I'll tell you the truth, silence is the shield of a liar, and everyone here should remember that before putting their trust or their money in his hands." Gasps, murmurs. The words hung like smoke choking the air. Darius's expression didn't change. His silence wasn't a shield. It was strategy. And slowly, those watching began to realize it. A man in a gray suit muttered to his wife, "She's pushing too far." Another woman near the string lights shook her head, whispering, "That's not how you treat someone at a table this important." The tide was subtle, but it was turning. Not because Darius had shouted or defended himself, but because restraint in the face of cruelty carried more weight than any counterattack. Victoria didn't see it, or she refused to. She lifted her glass, smiling wide, reveling in the sound of her own voice. But for the first time, a trace of unease flashed in her eyes. Because the crowd wasn't laughing with her anymore. They were watching closely, silently, waiting for what Darius King would do next. The garden felt split in two. On one side, Victoria Hale's voice still rang sharp, clinging to the air like broken glass. On the other, silence heavy, deliberate, and anchored around Darius King. She didn't stop. She couldn't. "This is what happens," she announced to the investors gathered in sequined gowns and tailored tuxedos. "We let people like him sneak into rooms they don't belong, and then we're surprised when everything collapses. I won't stand by and watch a multi-billion-dollar deal be handed to a fraud." The word fraud landed again, but weaker this time. Not because she said it softer, because it no longer carried the same conviction. Gasps moved through the crowd, followed by a hush that felt colder than the evening breeze. A young waiter, frozen mid-step with a tray of champagne, glanced nervously between the two figures. The band had stopped playing entirely, instruments silent as if the music itself refused to score this ugliness. Evelyn Ross finally rose from her chair, slow but steady, her age giving her words more weight than volume. "Victoria," she said firmly, "enough." All eyes snapped to her. Evelyn rarely spoke at gatherings like this, and never without purpose. Her voice was calm but edged with steel. You're not questioning numbers. You're not questioning process. You're questioning a man's right to stand here." Victoria's smile flickered, but she caught it quickly. "I'm protecting this company's future," she countered, her tone still dripping with charm. "I have every right to call out deception when I see it." Lucas Grant, heart racing, lowered his phone for a moment. He couldn't believe Evelyn had stepped in. He whispered to himself, "Finally, someone said it." Then he lifted his phone again, determined not to miss a second. The crowd murmured louder now. The division was visible, some leaning toward Evelyn, others still staring at Darius, waiting for him to crumble, waiting for a defense he never gave. But Darius remained unflinching. His silence was no longer mistaken for weakness. It was beginning to feel like control. He met Evelyn's eyes briefly, the faintest nod passing between them, then turned back to Victoria. She smirked, desperate to regain footing. "Don't mistake pity for loyalty," she snapped, her words sharper than she intended. "He doesn't need your defense, Evelyn. If he were truly who he claims to be, he'd prove it himself." The challenge lingered. The investors leaned in, the air thick with anticipation. Darius King finally picked up his glass once more. The faint clink against crystal echoed in the quiet. His voice, low and deliberate, carried across the garden. "Careful," he said. "Accusations are like matches. Strike them too often, and eventually, the fire doesn't burn me, it burns you." The words didn't roar. They didn't need to. The crowd stilled, caught between the elegance of restraint and the inevitability of what was coming. Victoria Hale had lit too many matches, and the fire she thought she controlled was already turning back toward her. The moment Darius spoke, the garden shifted. His words weren't loud, but they landed heavier than Victoria's entire tirade. Guests exchanged glances, some leaning closer, others whispering behind raised glasses. The weight of his calm was beginning to outweigh her fury, but Victoria refused to yield. Her smile stretched too wide, her voice rising just a little sharper than before. "Threats now? Is that what we're hearing?" She tilted her head, her diamonds glittering in the lantern light. "You can dress it up, Darius, but everyone sees the same thing. A man hiding behind silence, behind metaphors, because he doesn't have the truth to stand on." She stepped closer, closing the distance, her heels pressing into the stone with deliberate rhythm. The crowd inhaled as one, sensing the escalation. Then she did what no one expected. With a sudden motion, she reached for the contract folder resting on a nearby table, the preliminary draft of the billion-dollar deal. With one sharp tug, she yanked it free and held it high. Gasps cracked through the garden. "This?" she sneered, pages fluttering in her manicured hand. "This is what you claim as your empire? Paper, empty signatures, nothing binding, nothing real." And with a dramatic flick, she let the pages scatter to the ground. White sheets rained over the trimmed grass, some landing at the polished shoes of investors. The act hit harder than her words. It wasn't just insult anymore, it was desecration. Evelyn Ross's jaw dropped, her eyes flashing with something between outrage and disbelief. "Victoria!" she barked, louder than anyone had heard her in years. "That is not your document to touch." Victoria only laughed, stepping back with mock innocence. "Oh, please, if it were real, it wouldn't crumble so easily." The crowd stirred uneasily. A man in a gray tuxedo muttered, "This isn't professional." Another whispered, "She's crossed the line." Phones began to rise discreetly. Not just Lucas's this time, several guests were recording, capturing the chaos for themselves. Lucas's hands trembled as he kept filming, his voice low but steady. "She just tore up his contract. She actually did it." Through it all, Darius didn't move to grab the papers or protest. He simply stood taller, his expression unchanged, his silence deafening. The restraint was so profound it unsettled everyone watching. Victoria smirked, mistaking that silence once again. "What now, Darius? Nothing to say? Nothing to prove? Then maybe it's time everyone here stops pretending and admits it. You don't belong at this table. You never did." Her words echoed into the hush. But in that silence, in the eyes of the crowd, the tide was no longer hers. The spectacle she'd crafted so carefully was unraveling, page by page, moment by moment. And she didn't even realize it yet. The shredded papers still littered the grass, catching the glow of lanterns as if the contract itself had been turned into confetti for her show. The guests didn't clap, they didn't laugh. The hush was sharp now, every eye flicking between Victoria Hale's triumphant grin and Darius King's unbroken calm. For the first time, She looked as though she was performing for an audience that wasn't applauding. Darius bent slowly, picked up a single page from the grass, and brushed it clean with the same care one might give to a family heirloom. He placed it neatly back on the table, then straightened, his tuxedo catching the light. His eyes swept the crowd, not her, not yet, but the dozens of witnesses who were now holding their phones higher. "Documents can be torn," he said evenly, his voice low but carrying. "But proof isn't written on paper. It's written in systems. It's written in contracts already signed, already sealed." He let the words hang. "And those don't vanish when someone throws a tantrum in silk." Gasps rippled again, not at the insult, but at the control laced through his tone. Victoria's eyes flashed. Bold words for a man who still hasn't shown us anything. She gestured to the ground, to the shredded pages. "If you had real power, Darius, you'd prove it. But all you've given them is silence and metaphors, and that's not enough." He didn't break eye contact. "Be careful what you demand," he said, the faintest hint of warning in his voice. "You might just get it." The words sent a current through the crowd. Evelyn Ross exhaled, leaning back in her chair, her suspicion replaced now with something closer to expectation. Lucas's phone trembled in his grip as he whispered, "It's coming. He's about to do it." Victoria laughed, the sound brittle, forced. "Empty threats again. That's all you have." Darius reached into his pocket not with haste, not with drama, but with precision. He drew out his phone, its screen lighting his face with a cold glow. His thumb tapped once. The sound of a call connecting cut through the night. "Jaden," he said, his voice calm enough to make the crowd lean in. "It's time." There was no further explanation, no declaration, just those two words. Victoria's smirk faltered. For the first time, she blinked, as though unsure what she had just provoked. The crowd shifted forward, murmurs rising. Something was happening, something bigger than torn paper or loud accusations. They didn't know what, but the certainty in his tone told them enough. Darius King wasn't playing defense anymore. The counterstrike had begun. The call ended with a soft click, but the sound echoed louder than Victoria's laughter ever had. Darius slid his phone back into his pocket, calm, deliberate, as though he had just shifted the ground beneath everyone's feet. The crowd felt it. A murmur rose, cautious, curious. Phones were lifted higher, not just to record Victoria's antics anymore, but to capture him, the man who hadn't shouted, hadn't defended himself, but whose silence now felt like control. Victoria forced a laugh, brittle as glass. "What was that? A bluff? You think calling your assistant makes you look powerful?" She turned in a slow circle, addressing the guests as if they were her jury. "Look at him hiding behind theatrics. If he had proof, he would have shown it. If he had power, he wouldn't need to stall." But the cracks were showing. Her voice, once confident, carried a tremor at the edges. The guests heard it. Evelyn Ross did too. She leaned forward, eyes narrowing, studying Victoria now more than Darius. Then a vibration rippled across the garden. One by one, the phones of investors buzzed with alerts. Screens lit up in the dim light, notifications flashing the same subject line. King Global Holdings, official statement. The shift was instant. Guests glanced down, scrolling, reading. Murmurs grew into gasps. Screens reflected across faces, contracts confirmed, signatures authenticated, announcements made public in real time. The $4.2 billion deal wasn't rumor. It was sealed. It was his. Victoria's smirk collapsed. She spun, eyes darting from one glowing phone to another. What is that? Some trick? He hacked this." But Evelyn stood now, her voice cutting through the night with more force than Victoria's ever had. "No, Victoria. This is real. I'm reading the filings myself. Time-stamped, sealed." She held her phone higher, her gaze locking on Darius. He wasn't bluffing. The crowd shifted all at once, the weight of their doubt turning into something else entirely: recognition. Respect. Victoria's face drained of color. She tried to laugh again, but it broke halfway, brittle and hollow. No, this isn't possible." Darius finally looked at her, not with anger, not with gloating, but with something colder, certain. "You wanted proof," he said quietly. "Now the whole world has it." The words hit harder than a shout. Around him the crowd erupted, not with applause yet, but with voices rising, guests pointing, murmuring, recording. The tide had turned completely, and Victoria stood at the center of it, exposed. Darius King had revealed nothing and everything at once. And for the first time that night, Victoria Hale looked small. The garden was no longer silent, it was alive with the sound of realization. Investors leaned into their screens, scrolling, confirming. A buzz of disbelief rippled through the party. But the disbelief wasn't aimed at Darius anymore, it was aimed at Victoria. Her poise faltered. She tried to stand taller, but her red gown felt heavier now, as though it dragged her down with every breath. This doesn't prove anything," she stammered, her voice stripped of the velvet it once carried. "He staged this, it's smoke, all of it." But no one was listening. Evelyn Ross lowered her phone, her expression sharp with certainty. "The filings are official. Government seals, public record. You can't stage that, Victoria. Not tonight." Her words weren't loud, but they cut with finality. The crowd turned, dozens of eyes narrowing on Victoria. Phones pointed not at Darius now, but at her, the woman who had just torn up paper and a reputation with equal carelessness. Lucas, still filming, whispered under his breath, "They see it now. They all see it." Victoria's smile broke entirely. Her hand shook as she tried to lift her glass, but the trembling betrayed her. For the first time, she wasn't the one holding the room. Darius took a step forward, not fast, not dramatic, but enough to reclaim the ground she had stolen. "You wanted the spotlight," he said calmly, his gaze fixed on her. "Now it's yours, but the world doesn't see your power. They see your desperation." The words didn't roar. They didn't need to. The garden had already chosen who to believe. And in that moment, the woman who arrived glittering in diamonds and confidence stood stripped bare, her performance collapsing under the weight of a truth she could no longer bend. Phones were still raised, capturing every angle, every word. What began as Victoria's stage had become her downfall, streamed through 100 lenses, immortalized before she could catch her breath. The buzz of conversations turned sharper, voices no longer hesitant but certain. The tide had broken and it was against her. Darius let the moment breathe. He didn't rush to fill the silence. He knew the power of letting truth settle, of giving the crowd time to weigh what they had just seen. His presence alone was enough. Then he spoke, his tone calm but firm, every syllable measured like a verdict. "Victoria Hale," he said, her name carrying across the garden. "Effective immediately, you and your firm are removed from this deal. Every contract, every clause, every tie severed." The crowd erupted gasps, whispers, a ripple of shock. Evelyn Ross's lips curved into the faintest nod of approval, her sharp eyes glinting with vindication. Victoria staggered, the wine glass slipping from her hand and shattering against the stone. Red liquid spilled like blood at her feet. You can't do that," she stammered, voice cracking. "You don't have the authority." But Darius cut her off with the quiet strength of a man who had already won. "I own the authority. I don't need to raise my voice for you to hear it." From the back of the garden, Jaden Brooks appeared, phone in hand, his voice steady and clear. "It's done. The documents have been restructured. Victoria Hale's name has been removed from all records. Every partner has already received confirmation." The words fell like a gavel. The crowd turned to Victoria, once admired, now dismantled. Her beauty, her gown, her diamonds, they couldn't mask the collapse. For the first time all night, she looked small. Evelyn rose fully now, her voice carrying weight. "You've humiliated this man, slandered him in front of us all, and now the truth has exposed you. Leave, Victoria, before the shame follows you further than this garden." Victoria's eyes darted, searching for an ally, but found none. Guests pulled away, some turning their backs, others lifting their phones higher to record her fall. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Her silence was no longer power, it was defeat. Darius didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply adjusted his cuff, reclaiming the dignity she had tried to strip away, and let the garden itself pronounce judgment. Justice had been served not with shouting, not with fists, but with truth, restraint, and authority that could not be shaken. And Victoria Hale stood in the ruins of her own making. The garden fell into an uncanny stillness, as if the night itself waited for closure. Victoria Hale stood frozen, her diamonds dull now under the lantern light, her confidence stripped bare. No one moved toward her. No one defended her. The same crowd she tried to rally now turned their gaze to the man she tried to erase. Darius King. He stepped forward, past the scattered pages still on the grass, past the broken glass at her feet. His voice carried, calm and final. Power isn't proven by how loud you shout or how many eyes you can draw. It's proven by what endures after the noise fades. Tonight, noise has faded, and what remains is truth. The words struck deeper than any insult, deeper than any rebuttal could have. Guests nodded, murmured, lifted their phones higher, not out of spectacle now, but out of respect. Evelyn Ross placed her hand over her chest, pride softening her sharp expression. Lucas lowered his phone for just a moment, whispering, This is what justice looks like." Victoria's chest heaved, but no sound came. She turned once, desperate for an ally, then realized there were none. Her heels clicked against the stone as she fled, the red gown trailing behind her like a flame finally burned out. The crowd parted for her, but no one looked away from Darius. He reached for the contract pages once more, gathered them with deliberate care, and set them neatly back on the table. Then he looked at the room, not with anger, not with triumph, but with quiet authority. "They called me a fraud," he said softly. "But frauds vanish. I'm still here." Applause broke not a ripple this time, but a wave that filled the garden, loud enough to replace the music that had long stopped. And in that applause, dignity stood taller than diamonds, and justice needed no defense. It had already spoken.